The Hells Angels built the most feared motorcycle club on Earth. Then, the Bandidos showed up. In 60 years, the Red and Gold fought them across 4 continents, survived military rockets, buried their dead, and never once asked for permission. This is how they made the Angels afraid. Born into the shadow of the Hells Angels. To understand what the Bandidos became, you have to understand what they were born into and what they were born against. By the mid-1960s, the Hells Angels had already spent nearly 2 decades constructing the template for what an outlaw motorcycle club could be. Founded in Fontana, California, in 1948 by men who had returned from the Second World War and found peacetime insufficiently alive, the Angels had grown through the 1950s and into the 1960s into something that transcended the individual clubs and individual men that composed it. They had territory. They had an identity. They had a reputation that the press had amplified and the public had absorbed. And that reputation translated, in the criminal world, into real organizational power. By the time Hunter S. Thompson spent a year riding with them and wrote the book that made them permanently famous, the Angels were already the reference point by which every other outlaw club measured itself, the pole star of the outlaw world, the thing everything else navigated in relation to. That reference point also functioned as a ceiling. Every club beneath the Angels paid tribute. Every club that didn't paid with blood. In the world the Angels had built, smaller clubs operated below them, in acknowledged subordination to the precedent the Angels had established. You recognized who had been there first. You didn't move into their geography without acknowledgement. You wore your colors with the awareness that another set of colors held the senior claim to the ground beneath your boots. This was not a cultural norm. It was the law of the outlaw world, and the Angels enforced it the same way they enforced everything else. Donald Eugene Chambers didn't accept that framework. More precisely, he never entered it in the first place. Chambers was a former Marine from Texas, a man who had served in Vietnam and come home carrying whatever the war had given him and whatever it had permanently removed, who had joined several motorcycle clubs and found all of them lacking. Too soft, too accommodating, too willing to define themselves in relation to another club's precedent, rather than building something genuine from the ground up. When Chambers sat down to found the Bandidos on the 4th of March, 1966, in San Leon, Texas, he was not designing a club to operate inside the Angels' ecosystem. He was designing a club that didn't need anyone's ecosystem. He picked red and gold Marine Corps colors. He designed the fat Mexican mascot, round-faced, grinning, pistol in one hand, machete in the other. The face says welcome. The hands say something different entirely. He recruited Vietnam veterans specifically, men who'd already survived the worst thing the world could throw at them and come home to find nobody knew what to do with them. The Bandidos knew exactly what to do with them. Texas, in 1966, was not the Angels' territory. It was not anyone's territory in the organized sense that California was. Chambers was building in a space the Angels hadn't claimed, among men the Angels hadn't recruited, in a culture the Angels hadn't shaped. Within 3 years, the Bandidos had over 100 members. Within a decade, they were a documented criminal organization under federal surveillance. Within 3 decades, they had fought the Hells Angels to a military standstill across 4 Scandinavian countries with weapons the Angels hadn't anticipated. The Angels noticed they had no choice. What Chambers built in 1966 was not just a motorcycle club, it was a counter-argument, a lived, organizational refusal of the premise that the Angels' hierarchy was the only way the outlaw world could be structured. Every chapter the Bandidos added, every state they entered, every country they opened a chapter in, was another piece of evidence for the same proposition. That the Angels' dominance was not the natural order of things. It was a historical accident, the product of being first, being in California, being famous at the right moment, and historical accidents could be challenged by organizations willing to pay the cost of the challenge. The Angels had built a world where that challenge was supposed to be impossible. The Bandidos spent 60 years proving it wasn't. There is one more thing worth understanding about the founding that the mythology of the Bandidos tends to obscure. Chambers was not a charismatic rebel who stumbled into building something larger than himself. He was a deliberate organizational builder, a Marine who understood the difference between a group of men with a shared attitude and a structured institution capable of surviving the removal of any individual within it. The decision to recruit specifically from Vietnam veterans, the choice of Marine Corps colors, the hierarchical structure he embedded from the first chapter, these were not accidents of personality. They were design decisions made by a man who understood how durable organizations were built and who intended to build one. The Hells Angels had been built the same way, by men who came back from a different war with the same understanding. What Chambers recognized in 1966 was that the Angels' structure could be replicated outside Angels' territory, by men with the same background and the same discipline. Without the Angels' permission and without acknowledging their precedent, he was right. Everything that followed is the proof. The territories that started the war, the first front of the war between the Bandidos and the Hells Angels, was not fought with bombs or bullets, it was fought with geography. The Bandidos won it simply by being in places the Angels hadn't reached yet, and by building something strong enough to hold those places when the Angels eventually showed up. Texas was the most consequential of those territories. The Angels had no meaningful presence there through the 1970s and into the 1980s, not because they overlooked it. Texas has a substantial motorcycle culture, deep criminal infrastructure, and significant narcotics transit activity through the Mexican border, exactly the kind of state the Angels would have absorbed on standard terms. The standard terms never applied. By the time the Angels looked seriously at Texas, the Bandidos had been there for over a decade. Chapters in Houston, San Antonio, Dallas, Fort Worth, across the Hill Country, the Rio Grande Valley, deep into the Panhandle. Distribution channels into Mexico and back through networks the club had spent years building. Recruitment pipelines into every veterans bar in the state. The Bandidos hadn't just entered Texas. They had become it, and the men who ran those chapters had spent a decade learning every pressure point, every law enforcement pattern, every criminal relationship. The state offered advantages that don't show up in any organizational chart, but that determine the outcome of every real-world confrontation. A club that has built a major state before you arrive is not a club you absorb on your own schedule. It is a club you fight for the territory or leave alone, and fighting it in its own home state, on ground it had held for a decade, against men who'd spent that decade learning the terrain that calculation didn't resolve in the Angels' favor. Texas stayed Bandidos' territory. The Angels accepted that and filed it away as a permanent fact of the American outlaw landscape. The pattern repeated internationally with the same logic each time. The Bandidos arrived first, built before the Angels consolidated, and established a presence durable enough to resist absorption. In Australia, Anthony Spencer's newly recognized Sydney chapter in 1983 arrived in a country where the Angels had presence but not dominance. The Milperra massacre the following year settled the question of whether the Bandidos intended to compete seriously, brutally, and permanently. In continental Europe, Bandidos chapters opened through the 1980s and 1990s in Germany, Belgium, France, and Scandinavia, all territories. The Angels had been systematically consolidating, all suddenly contested by an organization that had not asked for permission to enter. In Scandinavia, the Angels' attempt to remove the Bandidos from their newly claimed territory became the most extreme military conflict the outlaw motorcycle world has ever produced. The failure of that attempt, over 4 years and across 4 countries, is the clearest single answer to why even the Hells Angels came to regard the Bandidos with something very close to institutional fear. There is a broader principle embedded in the territorial strategy the Bandidos employed, whether consciously or through the organic logic of building where space existed. The Angels' power was built on precedent, on the accumulated weight of being first, being established, being the reference point everyone else navigated in relation to. Precedent is powerful, but it has a specific vulnerability. It only applies to places where it was established. In a territory where you arrived after a rival had already built, your precedent means nothing. The Bandidos didn't challenge the Angels' precedent in California. They built their own precedent in Texas and then exported it. By the time the Angels looked at Texas and Scandinavia and Australia seriously, the Bandidos' precedent was already in place, and the Angels found themselves in exactly the position that every smaller club had always found itself in relation to them, trying to displace an organization that had built before they arrived. The Milperra Massacre. Anthony Mark Spencer's founding of Australia's first Bandidos chapter in 1983 was not a quiet institutional development. It was the product of a split from the Comancheros motorcycle club, so bitter and so personal that open conflict between the two clubs was never a possibility. It was a certainty. Spencer had led a faction that burned their Comancheros colors, a formal, irreversible act of separation, and then sought and received official recognition from the Bandidos' American leadership. Comancheros national president William Jock Ross experienced this as both personal betrayal and an American invasion of Australian outlaw culture. Neither interpretation made him inclined toward patience. The men who had just burned his club's colors were now wearing the patch of a Texas organization that had no history in Australia and no right, in Ross's understanding, to any part of it. By August of 1984, a phone call between Spencer and Ross had served as a declaration of war. 6 weeks later, that war had a massacre to its name. The 2nd of September, 1984. Father's Day in Australia, the Viking Tavern in Milperra, a suburb of Sydney. The British Motorcycle Club was hosting a swap meet, families in attendance, children present, the ordinary texture of a Sunday afternoon in a suburban location that had no history and no reason to be remembered for anything other than what happened in its parking lot. Both the Comancheros and Spencer's Bandidos arrived. Both arrived armed. At the height of the confrontation, Jock Ross raised a machete and gave the order. What followed lasted less than 10 minutes. 7 people were dead when it ended. 4 Comancheros, 2 Bandidos, and Leanne Walters, 14 years old, at a Father's Day event with her family, with no connection to either club and no awareness of what she had walked into. She was killed by crossfire from a war she had no part in. 20 more people were wounded before 200 police officers reached a scene where the killing was already finished. A 14-year-old girl came to a family event on a Sunday and never went home. That is the fact that has never left Australian public consciousness, and it has defined every subsequent legislative and public debate about outlaw motorcycle clubs in the country. Milperra produced Australia's first serious anti-biker statutes, forced parliamentary debates that had previously existed only in theory, and permanently changed how the country understood what these organizations were. Not individual criminals who happened to ride together, not fraternal clubs with occasional bad members. Organizations that could arrive armed at a community event on a Sunday afternoon, meet in a parking lot, and produce 7 bodies and 20 wounded in under 10 minutes. Spencer was convicted of manslaughter and served time in Australian custody. The verdict satisfied almost no one. The chapter he founded kept growing after his release. New chapters opened across the continent. The red and gold had made its entrance in Australia in the most unforgettable way possible, and the consequences of that entrance are still written into Australian law today. What Milperra also established, beyond the immediate legislative consequences, was the Bandidos' willingness to absorb catastrophic reputational damage in a new territory, rather than moderate their conduct to avoid. A club concerned primarily with public perception would have handled the Comancheros split differently, would have avoided the confrontation at the Viking Tavern, would have prioritized the long-term project of building community legitimacy in a new country over the short-term demands of a war with a rival club. The Bandidos did not make those trade-offs. They absorbed the massacre, absorbed the legislation it produced, absorbed the public condemnation, and kept building. That willingness to pay enormous reputational and legal costs, rather than accept constraints on how they operated, is one of the most consistent features of the club's behavior across every theater they have entered. The Nordic War. The Great Nordic Biker War, which ran from 1993 to 1997 across Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Finland, is the single most important chapter in the documented history of the Bandidos' conflict with the Hells Angels. Nothing else in the outlaw world's history looks like it. Not the Quebec Biker War, not the California conflicts between the Angels and the Mongols, not 50 years of East Coast violence. The Nordic conflict was, in terms of the weapons deployed, the geographic scope, the civilian casualties, and the legislative responses it forced from 4 national governments simultaneously, something that belongs in a category by itself. The background matters. From 1980 onward, the Angels had been building Scandinavian chapters the same way they built everywhere else: patient, systematic, absorbing smaller clubs or breaking them. By the early 1990s, they regarded Scandinavia as consolidating, absorbing smaller clubs or breaking them. By the early 1990s, they regarded Scandinavia as consolidating, not finished, but moving in the right direction. Then, in 1993, a Danish club called the Undertakers patched over to become Bandidos Denmark. The Angels didn't read this as a business decision. They read it as an invasion, the second largest outlaw organization on Earth, planting a flag inside territory the Angels had been claiming for a decade. Their response was calibrated to end the Bandidos' Scandinavian presence before it could take root. They failed, completely. And the way they failed matters as much as the fact that they did. In February 1994, a Hells Angels member was killed in a shooting in Denmark. Within days, not weeks, days, the Angels clubhouse in Helsingborg, Sweden, was struck by an anti-tank rocket, not a pipe bomb, not an improvised device. A military anti-tank rocket, sourced, transported, and deployed across a national border within days of the opening shot. The Bandidos had military weapons. They were willing to use them immediately. That single fact forced the Angels to recalibrate everything they thought they knew about the organization they were fighting. What followed over the next 3 years was relentless. Chapter presidents on both sides were assassinated. Coordinated bomb attacks struck club properties across 4 countries on the same nights. In July 1995, the Angels killed Bandidos Sweden president Michael Joe Ljunggren, a targeted decapitation of chapter leadership. The Bandidos answered on Christmas Day, 1995, with violence in Denmark. By 1996, the war had moved into airports. The Angels ambushed Bandidos at Oslo's Gardermoen and Copenhagen's Kastrup, 2 of the busiest transit hubs in Northern Europe, full of families and travelers who had nothing to do with any of this. People died in airports. In October 1996, 3 Angels clubhouses across Scandinavia were struck simultaneously in a single night. The Bandidos were coordinating military-style operations across 4 countries in real time, and 4 national governments had no legal framework that could stop them. Then came Irene Asbo Barv. She was driving past a Bandidos clubhouse in Norway in June 1997 when her car was caught in an explosion intended for someone else. She had no connection to either club. She was in the wrong place during a war she didn't know existed. She died for it. 11 people were dead by the time both clubs agreed to a truce. In September 1997, nearly 100 had been injured. Emergency anti-biker legislation passed across Scandinavia within months, laws written specifically because the existing statutes had been proven, at enormous cost, to be inadequate for what these organizations had become. The truce ended the war. It did not end the Bandidos' presence in Scandinavia. Their chapters survived 4 years of military-grade conflict against the most powerful outlaw club in the world and were still operating when the shooting stopped. The Angels had thrown everything they had at them. The Bandidos were still there. You cannot fear a club you have destroyed. You can only fear one that is still standing. The truce ended the formal war. It did not remove the Bandidos from Scandinavia. Their chapters survived 4 years of the most extreme organizational pressure the outlaw world had ever generated and continued operating when the guns went quiet. The Angels had thrown military-grade ordnance, presidential assassinations, and coordinated multi-country bombing campaigns at the Bandidos' Scandinavian presence. At the end of those 4 years, the Bandidos were still there. The Angels, who had entered the conflict intending to make the Bandidos' Scandinavian presence a brief and costly mistake, came out of it understanding that what they were dealing with was not going away. That understanding is what the Nordic War ultimately established. Not that the Bandidos could win a conflict against the Angels everywhere simultaneously, no organization could, but that they could take everything the Angels had to offer in a specific theater, absorb it, match it weapon for weapon and death for death, and come out the other side still present in the territory that had triggered the war. You cannot fear a club you have destroyed. You can only fear one that is still standing when the smoke clears. What the Nordic War produced beyond the immediate casualties and legislation was a permanent change in how law enforcement agencies across the Western world categorized outlaw motorcycle clubs. Before 1993, the dominant framework was individual criminality within a fraternal organization, bad members making bad decisions, not an institutional threat requiring institutional response. After 1997, after 4 countries had watched airports turned into battlefields and military rockets deployed in suburban neighborhoods, that framework was no longer available to anyone who had paid attention. The Bandidos and the Angels had demonstrated, at the cost of 11 lives and nearly 100 injuries, that they were capable of sustained military-style operations across national borders with weapons and coordination that peacetime law enforcement was not designed to confront. The institutional reclassification that followed the tier designations, the new legislative frameworks, the dedicated organized crime units were all products of Scandinavia. The Bandidos didn't just fight the Nordic War, they changed how governments understood what they were. The alliances that changed everything. The Bandidos did not build their position against the Hells Angels alone. The full picture of why the Angels regard the red and gold with institutional caution requires understanding the alliance network the Bandidos have maintained across decades, relationships that collectively deny the Angels the kind of undisputed global dominance their size and history would otherwise suggest they should hold. The most significant alliance in the Bandidos' history was forged in 1978, when Ronnie Hadge brought the club to Daytona Beach's Bike Week and established a working relationship with the Outlaws Motorcycle Club. What started as complementary drug distribution, the Outlaws moving cocaine from Florida, the Bandidos supplying methamphetamine from Texas, developed into something strategically far larger. The Bandidos and Outlaws share a common enemy and a common refusal, maintained across decades of pressure to acknowledge the Angels' authority in their respective territories. The Outlaws have held the Midwest and parts of the East Coast against Angels' expansion for decades. The Bandidos have held Texas and expanded internationally. Neither front would be as defensible without the other, and both clubs understand this clearly enough that the relationship has survived the kinds of pressures that normally fracture criminal alliances over time. Shared enemies make for durable partners. The alignment with the Pagans Motorcycle Club adds a third front the Angels cannot address without opening exposure on the other two. The Pagans have been at open, documented, unresolved war with the Hells Angels on the East Coast for more than 50 years. They have absorbed losses that would have finished most organizations and kept fighting. Their alignment with the Bandidos creates a challenge the Angels cannot resolve, with a single prosecution arresting. Bandidos' leadership in Texas does nothing to the Pagans' position in Philadelphia or New York, and nothing targeting the Pagans touches the Bandidos' Texas infrastructure. Each front protects the others by demanding the Angels divide their attention. The Angels are larger than any of these clubs individually. They have always been larger. That has never been the decisive factor, because size doesn't matter when you're taking fire from multiple directions simultaneously and can't fully respond to any of them without leaving the others open. The Bandidos built a coalition that forces exactly that problem on the Angels, and the Angels have been unable to solve it for over 4 decades. What the Bandidos' alliance network accomplished that the Angels have never been able to fully counter is the creation of a multi-front problem that resists single-point solutions. Every significant tool the Angels have used against individual rivals, sustained territorial pressure, federal cooperation through informants, targeted violence against leadership, works against a single organization focused in a single geography. None of it works the same way against a network where displacing one node strengthens the other's case for resistance, and where the removal of leadership in one club has no effect on the operational capacity of the aligned clubs on adjacent fronts. The Bandidos didn't just build themselves to be hard to destroy. They built a coalition that made the Angels' preferred method of resolution concentrate force, eliminate the threat, move on, structurally inapplicable to the problem the coalition represented. Waco, the deadliest biker shootout in American history. The Cossacks Motorcycle Club had been expanding through Texas's central and northern corridors for years before May 2015, and they had been doing it with a deliberateness that the Bandidos found intolerable. Texas was not neutral territory. It was the state where the Bandidos had been founded in 1966, where they had operated continuously for nearly 5 decades, and where any club moving through the geography was expected to acknowledge that history formally and visibly through a Support Your Local Bandidos patch that signaled the wearing club's understanding of who owned the ground beneath them. The Cossacks had been refusing that acknowledgement, with increasing visibility, as their membership grew. The Bandidos did not read this as a preference about what went on a vest. They read it as a territorial declaration, deliberate and sustained, and requiring a response that matched its seriousness. The 17th of May, 2015, Twin Peaks Restaurant, Waco, Texas. Law enforcement already knew enough to stage officers outside before the first shot was fired. They'd assessed the meeting in advance as potentially explosive. They were right, and being right wasn't enough. When the shooting started, it moved faster than any external response could contain, and when it stopped, 9 people were dead, 18 were wounded, and 177 individuals were in custody, transported in city buses because there weren't enough police vehicles to carry them. The majority of the dead were Cossacks. In a single afternoon in a Texas parking lot, the Bandidos had produced the deadliest biker confrontation in the recorded history of the United States, a body count without precedent in domestic outlaw motorcycle violence, in a public space, in broad daylight, in the middle of Texas. Then the legal system tried to answer it and failed completely. The mass arrest warrants applied identical probable cause affidavits to all 177 people present without individual assessment of what each person had actually done. Courts found this constitutionally indefensible. Every charge against every defendant was dropped, not reduced, not selectively maintained for the most culpable, dropped entirely, across the board. The deadliest biker confrontation in American history produced 0 convictions connected to what caused it. 9 dead, 177 arrested, 0 convictions, and the Bandidos were still holding Texas the next morning. That outcome, the capacity to produce violence at that scale in their home state, and the organizational resilience to walk away from the legal aftermath of it completely intact, is precisely what makes rival organizations think twice before challenging the Bandidos on ground they regard as theirs. The Waco confrontation also clarified something about the Bandidos' relationship to legal consequence that their history had suggested, but never demonstrated so starkly. The club did not moderate its conduct in anticipation of law enforcement response, even when law enforcement was visibly present and staged before the shooting started. The officers outside Twin Peaks were not a deterrent. They were a detail the Bandidos were aware of and proceeded past anyway. That tells you something specific about the organizational calculus at work, not recklessness, but a specific confidence in the club's ability to manage legal consequences after the fact, rooted in 60 years of experience doing exactly that. The money behind the war. No account of why the Bandidos are a genuine rival to the Hells Angels, rather than simply an aggressive club that occasionally produces extreme violence, is complete without the criminal economics underneath everything else. Motorcycle clubs do not sustain multi-decade international conflicts, fund multi-year federal trials, or expand into 20 countries on chapter dues alone. They do it on criminal revenue. The Bandidos built that revenue at a scale that gave them the organizational depth every conflict they fought required. Methamphetamine was the primary engine. The Bandidos' position along the Texas-Mexico border corridor gave them access to precursor chemicals and manufacturing capacity that, through the late 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, was among the most significant in the continental United States. The DEA placed their methamphetamine operations consistently among the largest non-cartel drug networks in the country. Not because individual members were sophisticated chemists, because the club's organizational structure made the drug operations as durable and disciplined as everything else the club ran. The same hierarchy that protected the Bandidos from federal prosecution protected the drug business from federal disruption. The same code of silence that frustrated prosecutors protected the supply chain. It was one structure, serving multiple purposes, running on the same institutional discipline Chambers had embedded in 1966. The 1,978 alliance with the Outlaws added cocaine to the portfolio. Outlaws' product moved south and west from Florida. Bandidos' methamphetamine moved east and north. 2 established organizational networks created a complementary distribution system with the reliability that independent dealers simply cannot match: consistent volume, consistent payment, and the organizational capacity to absorb the arrest of individual members without the supply chain collapsing. Suppliers need that consistency. The bandidos and outlaws provided it, and the revenue that flowed back funded everything from legal defense to international expansion. Wars cost money. Anti-tank rockets cost money. Coordinating simultaneous operations across national borders costs money. Funding the defense of a national president through a 3-month federal racketeering trial costs money. The bandidos had money, built through decades of criminal revenue generated by the same organizational structure that made them impossible to prosecute at the institutional level. The federal racketeering cases against the club's leadership consistently charged drug trafficking alongside murder conspiracy, not because prosecutors were overreaching, but because the evidence was always there. The drug empire and the outlaw club were never two separate things. They were the same thing, run by the same people, under the same rules. That is why 60 years of law enforcement pressure has never been able to separate them. What made the Bandidos' criminal economy specifically durable, more durable than many comparable organizations that federal prosecution successfully dismantled, was its geographic foundation. The Texas-Mexico border corridor is one of the most significant narcotics transit corridors in the Western Hemisphere, and the Bandidos' deep infrastructure in Texas gave them access to that corridor at a structural level that competitors in other regions simply didn't have. They weren't buying product at market rates and reselling it at a margin. They were embedded in the supply chain at the source, which gave them pricing advantages, supply consistency, and the ability to absorb federal seizures without the supply chain collapsing, because they had multiple access points into the same corridor. That geographic advantage compounded over time. The longer the club operated in Texas, the deeper their relationships with the supply networks that ran through it, and the harder those relationships became to disrupt through conventional law enforcement targeting of individual members or individual shipments. It is one more version of the same principle that defined the Bandidos' territorial strategy everywhere. Build deep enough that removal becomes genuinely expensive, and the cost of removal exceeds what any adversary federal or outlaw is willing to pay. Pushing into California. While the Nordic War was burning across Scandinavia, a quieter but symbolically significant contest was developing in the one territory the Angels had always regarded as undeniably theirs, California. The state where the Angels were founded, where their mythology was built, where their dominant status was not claimed but historically embedded through 7 decades of organizational presence. California was not a front the Angels had ever needed to defend, until they did. The Bandidos' expansion into California was never their primary effort. Texas was home, Scandinavia was their most extreme theater. But California mattered as a statement, because entering California meant entering the space the Angels had always regarded as definitionally theirs, and the Bandidos entered it anyway. Multiple violent incidents across the state through the 1990s and 2000s demonstrated they were not going to treat the Angels' historical claim to California as a boundary worth respecting. They were going to go where their growth took them. They were going to answer Angels' challenges the same way they answered challenges anywhere else. The real significance of the California conflict was not any individual incident. It was what it revealed about the Bandidos' strategic position. The Angels could not dedicate full organizational attention to California without creating exposure somewhere else. Managing Bandidos' presence in Texas required resources. Managing Scandinavia for 4 years had consumed enormous capacity. Managing expansion in Australia, continental Europe, and California simultaneously, with a club specifically built for multi-front competition, was a categorically different challenge than any single rival had ever posed. The Mongols had already taken Southern California in 1977, forcing the Angels north in a loss they never reversed. The Vagos were pushing along the coast, the Bandidos were competing in their zones. California was no longer the Angels' unchallenged home, it was contested ground. That change is partly a Bandidos' contribution, and it is one the Angels have never found comfortable to acknowledge. The Mongols had already taken Southern California in 1977, forcing the Angels north in a territorial loss they never fully reversed. The Vagos were pushing along the coast, the Bandidos competed in their zones. What the cumulative effect of multiple simultaneous rivals produced in California was the transformation of the Angels' unchallenged home into genuinely contested ground that no single prosecution and no single victory could fully resolve. That transformation matters beyond California specifically. It demonstrated that the Angels' territorial dominance, the model they had built everywhere, and that every other club in the country had accepted as the terms of the outlaw world, was not permanent. It could be challenged, it could be fragmented, and once fragmented in the Angels' own home state, the model's claim to permanence everywhere else weakened proportionally. The Bandidos understood this, whether explicitly or through institutional experience. Pressure in California wasn't just about California, it was about demonstrating in the most visible possible geography that the hierarchy the Angels had built was not fixed. Why they never fall. Every serious analysis of why the Bandidos have sustained conflicts with the Hells Angels across multiple continents and decades, conflicts that would have dismantled most organizations on at least one front, arrives at the lays. Same answer. Structure. Not the charisma of any individual, not the violence of any specific member, not geography or luck alone. The organizational architecture chambers designed in 1966 and subsequent leaders refined over 60 years is what makes the Bandidos uniquely capable of absorbing sustained assault and continuing to function. Most organizations are built around people. The Bandidos were built around a system. The financial architecture was the foundation. Dues collected at every chapter level funded legal defense for incarcerated members, supported families through custodial periods, and bankrolled international expansion without the need to generate new revenue for each new territory. A Bandidos chapter opening in Germany in the 1990s drew on institutional resources accumulating since the late 1960s. That financial depth gave the club the capacity to survive federal prosecutions that bankrupt most criminal enterprises. The legal fees alone for a multi-year RICO trial can destroy an organization that depends on its leadership. Remaining free, the Bandidos could fund their leaders' defense indefinitely through the same dues structure that funded everything else. The trial could last as long as it needed to. The money didn't run out. The hierarchical architecture was the second pillar, and the one that most consistently frustrated federal prosecution. What you knew in the Bandidos was rationed by rank. A hangaround knows what a hangaround needs to know. A chapter officer knows his chapter. A national officer knows the full picture. Arresting a member at any level below national leadership produced a witness who genuinely couldn't testify to what prosecutors needed because he had never been told. Getting to the national leadership required informants placed at the national level, working for years, at personal risk that made each one extremely expensive to develop and extremely difficult to replace if discovered. Both major federal prosecutions of the Bandidos' leadership, the 1988 case against Ronnie Hadge, and the 2018 case that produced consecutive life sentences for National President Jeffrey Pike and National Vice President John Portillo, required exactly that investment. Both convicted their targets, neither dismantled the club. The architecture told the men below the arrested leadership exactly what to do when that leadership was removed. That is the thing no prosecution has ever solved. You can convict the man, you cannot convict the position. The position keeps existing. The next man steps into it, inherits the same structure, the same code, the same institutional memory of everything that has been tried before and what it cost. The Bandidos have been building that memory since 1966. That is the thing no prosecution has ever solved and no rival conflict has ever overcome. You can convict the man, you cannot convict the position. The position keeps existing, waiting for the next person who steps into it and picks up the same obligations, the same code, and the same institutional memory of everything that has been tried before and what it cost. The Hells Angels operate by the same principle. What makes the Bandidos' version of this resilience significant in the specific context of the war between the two clubs is that it means the competition cannot be resolved externally. Arresting the Bandidos' national president does not end the Bandidos' competition with the Angels any more than arresting the Angels' national president ends the Angels' response to it. Both organizations have built themselves to outlast the people who currently run them. Both have succeeded. which means the conflict between them is structural and permanent, not personal and resolvable, and both clubs have understood that for decades longer than most law enforcement agencies were willing to admit it. The prosecutions that couldn't stop them. In September 2016, a federal grand jury in San Antonio indicted Jeffrey Fay Pike and John Xavier Portillo, the national president and national vice president of the Bandidos, on charges of racketeering conspiracy, murder conspiracy, drug trafficking, assault, and firearms violations. The indictment was years in the making, built from multiple informants, surveillance operations, financial records, and the coordinated investigative capacity of several federal agencies. It was designed to do what federal racketeering prosecutions have been designed to do since RICO was written: remove the people at the top, disrupt the structure beneath them, and watch the organization fail to recover. Pike was convicted in May 2018 on all major counts: life in federal prison without practical prospect of release. Portillo was convicted alongside him, 2 consecutive life sentences plus 20 additional years. The 2 most senior figures in the Bandidos motorcycle club were simultaneously removed from it and placed in federal custody for the remainder of their natural lives. It was the most significant federal action against the club's national leadership in its history, the product of more than a decade of investigative work and the testimony of informants who had operated at significant personal risk inside the club's inner circles. The Bandidos kept running. New leadership stepped into the vacant positions through the club's internal processes, and the same processes the hierarchical architecture had always made available, regardless of who occupied the senior roles. Chapters met on schedule. Dues flowed up the chain. The organization that had produced 2 consecutive national presidents sentenced to life in the same courtroom continued operating on the same principles Chambers had established in 1966. No chapter folded. No alliance fractured. No recruitment stopped. The club didn't even pause. Law enforcement agencies that have prosecuted the Bandidos across 6 decades have learned the same lesson every time. You can convict the person. You cannot convict the position. The position simply waits for the next person to step into it, and the next person always does. That institutional continuity, the ability to function identically before and after the removal of its most senior leadership, is the quality that separates the Bandidos from criminal organizations that federal prosecutions actually finish. There is a detail in the 2018 prosecution that the headlines rarely captured, because the convictions themselves were significant enough to dominate the coverage. The informants who built the case against Pike and Portillo had been operating inside the club's inner circles for years before the indictment. Years. Operating at personal risk in an organization that has killed people for much lesser betrayals, in a club whose code of silence was enforced not through cultural pressure alone, but through the documented history of what happened to men who broke it. The investment of human capital required to build that prosecution, and the fact that the prosecution succeeded in convicting both targets, was genuinely remarkable by any standard of federal law enforcement. And the club still didn't fall, which tells you something specific about the gap between what it takes to convict the leadership of an organization like the Bandidos and what it takes to actually end it. The 2018 convictions of Pike and Portillo sit alongside the 1,988 conviction of Ronnie Hadge as the 2 most significant federal actions against the Bandidos' national leadership in the club's history. Hadge received 5 years, and the club survived. Pike and Portillo received life sentences, and the club survived. The escalation in sentence length from 5 years to life, across 3 decades of prosecutorial effort, reflects the federal government's own recognition that the standard sentencing frameworks were not producing the institutional disruption they were designed to create. Life sentences produced the same outcome that 5-year sentences produced. The Bandidos keep running. The club as cover. One of the most consistent failures in public and legal understanding of the Bandidos, a failure the club has exploited deliberately across 6 decades, is the tendency to treat the motorcycle club and the criminal enterprise as separable, as if the leather cuts, the rallies, the charity runs, the public events were a surface beneath which a separate criminal organization happened to operate. They are not separable. The motorcycle club is the criminal organization. The same structure, the same hierarchy, the same code of conduct, the same institutional loyalty, all of it serving both purposes simultaneously, neither one existing without the other. This is why the competition between the Bandidos and the Hells Angels has proven so durable, and why no federal prosecution has successfully ended it. Two criminal enterprises fighting over drug territory can be disrupted by arresting the distributors and seizing the product. Two motorcycle clubs that are also criminal enterprises cannot be disrupted the same way, because dismantling the criminal enterprise means dismantling the club, and dismantling the club means confronting an organization whose members include people who have never committed a crime beyond riding a motorcycle and paying dues. That legal complexity is not an accident. It is the design. The ambiguity is the protection. The public-facing activities, the rallies, the toy runs, the visible presence at community gatherings serve a function that goes beyond reputation management. They create the legal and constitutional ambiguity that makes institutional prosecution extremely difficult to sustain through courts. Courts have been debating for decades exactly where the line falls between a motorcycle club that has criminal members and a criminal organization that uses a motorcycle club as its structure. The Bandidos have understood, whether explicitly or through institutional learning built across 60 years of prosecution, that the debate itself is a form of protection. As long as the question is genuinely open, the prosecution is genuinely difficult. The Hells Angels built the same dual structure for the same reason. Both clubs understood something it took law enforcement decades to fully accept. You can prosecute individuals within the organization indefinitely without ever touching the organization itself, as long as the organization has constructed enough legitimate activity to make the institutional prosecution constitutionally complex. 6 decades later, both structures are still standing. The prosecutors keep coming, unquote. As well, the clubs keep riding. The deeper insight that the Bandidos' organizational model produces and that the Angels' parallel model confirms is that criminal organizations built inside legitimate social structures are qualitatively different from criminal organizations that exist purely as criminal enterprises. The mafia, at its most powerful, was the former, a criminal enterprise embedded in ethnic community structures that gave it social legitimacy, legal complexity, and recruitment pools that pure criminal organizations cannot access. The major outlaw motorcycle clubs discovered the same principle independently and built it into their organizational DNA from the beginning. The motorcycle, the riding, the culture, the genuine fraternal bonds that the clubs produce alongside everything else is not a costume worn over a criminal organization. It is the foundation that makes the criminal organization possible, durable, and extraordinarily difficult to dismantle without destroying something that courts and legislatures have been reluctant to simply erase. Where they stand today. 6 decades after Donald Chambers stood in a Texas bar and built something that didn't exist, the Bandidos Motorcycle Club maintains chapters in more than 20 countries, a presence on 6 continents, and a position in the outlaw hierarchy that no prosecution or conflict has managed to permanently dislodge. The Hells Angels are larger. They were there first. They built the template that the Bandidos and every other serious outlaw club defined themselves against when they decided what they were. None of that is in dispute. What has been in dispute continuously, across 4 continents, over 6 decades, at enormous cost in blood and freedom, and years in federal custody, is whether being there first is the same thing as being dominant, whether size is the same thing as authority, whether the club that wrote the original rules gets to define the terms on which everyone who comes after them operates. The Bandidos' answer to that question has never changed. No. That answer was delivered in Texas in 1966 when Chambers built a club without asking the Angels' permission. It was delivered in Sydney in 1983 when the first Australian chapter opened. It was delivered in Helsingborg in 1994 when an anti-tank rocket hit an Angels clubhouse within days of the Nordic War's first shot. It was delivered in Waco in 2015 when 9 people died in a parking lot and the Bandidos kept riding Texas the following morning. It was delivered in a San Antonio federal courtroom in 2018 when 2 national presidents received life sentences and the club didn't slow down. The fear the Hells Angels carry for the Bandidos is not fear of any single act. It is the fear that accumulates when you have thrown everything available at something: military ordnance, federal prosecutions, coordinated multi-country conflict, and it remains. Still recruiting. Still flying the red and gold in 20 countries. Still answering every question about the hierarchy with the same single word. 6 decades of that. And the answer hasn't changed once. The club Chambers, founded in 1966, has now outlasted every federal prosecution mounted against it, every conflict with the angels in every theater, the incarceration of multiple national presidents, and 6 decades of law enforcement effort across 4 continents. It has done this not through luck or through the protection of any particular individual, but through the structural resilience of an institution built from its first day to survive the loss of anyone within it. What Chambers built was not a motorcycle club that happened to produce some dangerous people. It was a system, and systems, unlike people, don't get sentenced to life. They just keep going. The Hells Angels are the most recognized outlaw motorcycle club in the history of the world. They have been written about, filmed, prosecuted, and mythologized for 7 decades. They built the template that everyone else was measured against. And they still watch the red and gold across every territory they share, knowing that the club in the opposite corner has taken everything they had to offer, every rocket, every prosecution, every president sentenced to life, and is still riding. That is what genuine fear looks like in the outlaw world. Subscribe and hit the bell. There are more investigations like this one coming, and they don't get any lighter.